yet again to the special interview, and today, this time, we still have yet another special guest on today's program, and that is none other than Mr. Trevor Simumba, who is an economist, and it's going to help us understand the way forward concerning the IMF and Zambia's debt so far. And, well, looking at what's going on, well, there's information coming through saying Zambia is about to borrow $1.3 billion, yet we are owing a debt of $9.3 billion. And there's so much information that is coming in from there. And definitely Mr. Simumba will help us understand what we're talking about. It's good to have you, Mr. Simumba.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. So what do you think? What's your comment on this current status on this situation?
Yeah. First, let me just correct you that we are not yet at the level where we can say that definitely we're going to get the $1.3 billion from the IMF. We are very far from that. You know, the negotiations were suspended about a year ago, just about a year ago. So we're still in a very difficult situation. Our external debt, as you correctly say, is about $9.3 billion in terms of what the government says. But we also, in addition to that, we have domestic debt, which is close to about $5 billion. So our total public debt is about 15 billion United States dollars, okay, which is quite a hefty amount of debt that we have. So yes, so there are some, I would say, some very difficult times to come over the next 1 year or so, in order for us to bring our debt into manageable levels.
Okay, interesting. Now, also on the issue of the recently announced austerity measures by the Minister of Finance, Mr. Hamdudu has actually requested the ministry to bring out figures to show what savings may result if these measures were actually implemented effectively. I mean, what is your take on this situation?
Yes, I think Mr. Hamdudu is correct in saying that when you talk about austerity measures, you need to be talking about actual figures, real figures, you know, because the issue is that we are owing a lot of money, okay, and the minister has accepted the fact that we are at high risk of debt distress, which means we're at a high risk of not being able to meet our due payments for some of these debts, okay. So that means that we need to see clear-cut measures that tell us exactly how much we are going to save and how much of those savings are going to go to repaying the debt so that we can bring down the debt to a manageable level. So yes, he's very correct in asking government to come up with figures and also actually to come up with specifics, because that announcement by the minister was just a starting point. We need to know now which projects are actually going to be shelved, how much of the pipeline debt, you know, the debt that is supposed to be accumulated over the next 1 year, how much of that is going to be frozen, so that we know exactly what the figures are. Because that way, it will help even to make business people ready to know that, okay, you know, these projects are going to be shelved, you know. And then another important issue is the arrears, the debt arrears that the government owes to local suppliers, the business people that supply government. You know, we need to know how government plans to reduce those arrears and when they're going to make payments to the business people, because we need this money back into the economy. This money should not be held by the government.
Interesting. But also, how effective are these measures in terms of trying to return our Zambian economy back on track?
Look, it's very difficult to assess to what extent these measures are going to work until we actually see the details, you know, and we actually see government implementing them. I mean, look, soon after the announcement by the Minister of Austerity Measures, the President has traveled twice, you know. So that tells you that at the highest level, there is a lack of real commitment. Now, if at the highest level there's a lack of real commitment, what more at the civil service level? You know, do you expect civil servants to undertake these austerity measures? You know, so we really need to see real high-level commitment. I mean, the ministers and all of them, so, you know, should be showing the first commitment, president and the ministers. So, for example, ministers, should put a freeze on travel for the next 3-4 months, you know, because that's real, that's what we'll see as real commitment. You can't expect others to tighten their belts, but you, the leaders, are not tightening your belts. It's very unfair.
Interesting. But good thing you've mentioned the government getting involved in banning travels as well. But what other things can be prevented? I mean, what things can be put on hold in order to help us achieve this bill?
Yeah, the minister already announced that any project that is not at 80% completion will be either suspended, or for those that have not even started will just be basically shelved. Now, we have to be very careful. Projects, for example, projects such as the Chingola Solwezi Road, that project must be fast-tracked to be completed because that's an important economic asset, all right? So there are some projects which have got have got a major impact on the economy. Those kind of projects, I feel we need to make sure we push them forward. Secondly, I think government should ensure that whatever pipeline projects we have that are public-private partnerships, where government is using private money, those projects must be implemented as quickly as possible. Whatever is hindering them must be pushed as quickly as possible. Then we've also got private investments, you know, huge private sector investments, such as the Northwest Rail project. That project should be supported to take off because that's private. It's private money, but it's an important infrastructure project that will have a major impact on the cost of doing business and the cost of transportation. You know, we've got the Kafue Hydro Power Project, you know, and in fact, all the power projects should be fast-tracked, okay? And if possible, bring in private money, you know, private investment, even foreign direct investment into those projects, you know? Projects that relate to infrastructure that supports the mining industry, or for example, the multi-facility economic zones. All these types of projects, these should be fast-tracked to ensure that we can bring in the foreign direct investment. And then one final part is we've got a lot of state-owned enterprises that are loss-making. They're just putting more debt on the government's balance sheet. Those companies should be privatized. Those that can be privatized should be privatized. Those that can be commercialized. So, for example, you bring in private sector management to manage those organizations. Let it be done. So I'm looking at companies like Zambia Railways, you know, Tazara, you know, Zamtel. You know, why are we spending government money to keep these kind of companies operating? These companies should go and compete and be out there in the private sector. So the government really needs to look at all these issues apart from just saying, oh, we're going to reduce spending. There are many other things that they need to do.
Interesting. I'm glad you mentioned the private sector as well, because I was actually aiming at that as well. Looking at how the small-scale enterprises are actually, you know, developing, especially in each province in the country, how effective do you think they can be as a private sector in helping us bring back the economy to base?
The private sector is critical to driving economic growth. You know, unfortunately, this government has been following a philosophy of state-driven economic growth, but it has its limits. It has its limitations. You need the private sector involved. So this government needs to move out of driving economic growth and development and allow the private sector to thrive. So government should be focused more on facilitating private sector investment. You know, government should focus more on providing a legal framework to enable Zambian companies, especially the SMEs, to be able to be involved in the supply chain, in the value chain. So, for example, we should be encouraging the mines to be purchasing more and more goods and services from the SME sector. The government itself, they have a policy directive that 20% of construction projects should be done by Zambian companies. But just the other day, the Minister of Justice was complaining that this policy directive has not worked. The president himself talked about it as well. The Minister of Housing and Infrastructure. Now, this is something that it's in government's power to do. Why are they talking about it? Take action. Don't just talk, nice things. Take action. Make sure that companies, especially these Chinese companies, they're the biggest culprits. When they are given a contract by the government of Zambia, they must involve 20% of that must involve Zambian companies, and it must not simply just be giving a contract, but there must also be technology transfer, skills transfer, so that Zambian companies can begin to grow and be able to do much of this work. So we need a holistic approach. We need for these things to be legislated. We need to have a local contact act in this country that will ensure that Zambian companies have the opportunity and the potential to participate in the economic growth of this country.
Interesting. Now, you've mentioned Chinese who've actually come in at a... I could say they're coming at a large rate. Is it because they're the largest investors currently in the world, or, what limits should they have, apart from Chinese investors, but foreign investors? And also, how do they also help us, regain our economic abilities?
Look, the duty of any government is to maximize the benefits of investment, whether it's domestic or foreign direct investment. Now, China, by virtue of the size of its economy, by virtue of what it's doing around the world, it's now the #2 largest economy. And I believe very soon it will become the #1. It will beat the Americans in the next, I would say in the next 10 years or so. China will be #1, Now, the fact that they are #2, they are the large economy, okay, they will always be one of the top investors in any economy around the world. China invests in America, they invest everywhere. Here in Zambia, they're a big part of the foreign investment community, but they're not the only ones. Now, any investor, when you invest, you want to get a return on your investment. So I have nothing against foreign investors. But the problem we have in Zambia is that our policy towards investment is very skewed. It's skewed against domestic investment. It's not consistent. And so a lot of foreign investors take advantage of us, okay, in this country. So we need the government to enact legislation that is consistent across the board. And that is very clear that certain sectors of the economy are limited to domestic investors, okay? Then, secondly, the government needs to have the tax system, tax incentives should be structured in such a way that there should be an incentive for a foreign investor to partner with a Zambian company. Botswana does that. South Africa does that. In South Africa, they've got the Black Economic Empowerment Act. Botswana has a situation where companies, foreign investors will get grants, okay, if they employ more local Swanas, in the business. If they partner with a Botswana company, they'll be treated differently. So, these are things which are there, but they are scattered. We've got the Citizens Economic Empowerment Act, we've got the Procurement Act and others, but these things are scattered. They're not in one place. So we need one legislation that covers all these issues and is able to drive investment in the country.
Interesting. But also looking at the current debt level, debt crisis, can we call it a call for, is it a national emergency, or do we have time?
We have time, but we are not yet at an emergency, but we are definitely in a crisis, and it's important that the government and all of us as citizens, we work together and see how best we can get out of this crisis. It's a self-inflicted crisis. This crisis has got nothing to do with external forces. It's a self-inflicted crisis. We have been very poor in our management of our finances, public finance management. We've got inflated project costs. There's too much corruption, leakage. The Auditor General's report for the last 5 years, 6 years has been, sounding the alarm, but nobody's listening, nobody's taking action, So there's a lot of things that we need to deal with, and, I'm sure the government now has come to the realization that we need, and that's why they've announced austerity measures, because they know that we are in a crisis, and so we need to work very hard to get out of this. But we can get out of it. You know, it's not something that is impossible. We can get out of it, but certain decisions have to be taken, particularly by the president and the ministers.
Interesting. So now also, thank you so much for answering that. Okay, just before we go, before we move on, before we end rather, I'd like to know, what do you think, what's the effect of this to the SADC region? How does the SADC region get affected by this?
Well, the SADC region, look, the debt crisis in the region started with Mozambique, which is part of SADC, all right?
Yes.
It has now spread to Zambia, okay? Zimbabwe, now, because of the recent change, political change, and the fact that they're having upcoming elections, the new president has made some reforms. Zimbabwe is picking up again. You know, there's an improvement. But in terms of the SADC region, Zambia is at the highest risk of debt distress. South Africa has a much larger economy than ours. They are also facing issues in terms of their bonds have been declared junk status, you know. But then South Africa has a much bigger economy than Zambia, and their public finances are in a much better shape than ours. So in terms of the region, what it does is that, because Zambia is a major economy in SADC, okay? After South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, these are big economies. Tanzania as well. So obviously, what happens in Zambia has an effect in the surrounding region, you know. So what you'll find is that our friends, particularly South Africa and others, are concerned because South Africa has large investments in Zambia in the mining industry and in other sectors, you know, the ShopRites of this world and others. So the debt crisis doesn't have a direct effect in the region, but it has an effect in the sense that because we have a debt crisis, we have a contraction of the economy. Okay? The economy is not growing as fast as it was. The economy is now growing below 4%. It's about 3.4, 3.5%. So which means that when the economy is not growing, it means that the opportunity for business, for trade, declines, because already you can see we've reduced imports, we've reduced exports, you know. So those are the kind of effects you see. There's no direct effect, but what we call indirect effects in the rest of the region.
All right. Thank you so much for having had us with you, sir.
Thank you.
All right. That was Mr. Trevor Simumba, the economist, actually giving us his views on what the IMF is all about and the debt crisis that we're actually facing. I'm Jimmy Kanasha. Thank you so much for watching.